Dawntrail sure was an expansion, wasn't it? Opinions on it are very, very mixed. I have yet to see a Final Fantasy expansion that has divided people quite the way Dawntrail has, and I think I might have a pretty good idea why. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In this video, I'm going to go through Dawntrail's entire story and try to decide if I was right in my initial concerns about how Dawntrail was going to go. Did this story work as it was told? Is this a successful start of a brand new 10-year-long arc? That's what I'm here to figure out. This might get a little bit long, but we're going into a pretty deep dive into Dawntrail here, so strap in. Let's first start with what I think Dawntrail did objectively pretty well. Obviously, the graphical update makes Final Fantasy XIV an entirely new game. The best thing I can say about Dawntrail is that it really made me want to go back and play through the story all the way from the beginning again, just to see it in glorious high-definition textures and graphics. As an Aura player, I can't even tell you how revolutionary it was for my horns to not be blurry JPEGs and to actually reflect the light of the scene around me. And just running through flowers as they move around your character is genuinely a pretty captivating experience. So that's really good. The game looks great, and that makes it even more fun to play. And on the note of being fun to play, I think the dungeons and boss design of Dawntrail was definitely a step up from Endwalker. The dungeons are very challenging at points and require a lot more thought than just pushing a single button, and while leveling my healer to 100, I was repeatedly picking DPS up off the floor, only for them to die over and over again. And that's fun. I like a challenge, and I like when the content is engaging enough that you can't just expect to fumble your way through it on the first time. As much as I really loved Endwalker, the dungeons were pretty easy, and don't even get me started on the difficulty of the Alliance raids. Hopefully they continue to get better at designing bosses to be challenging, but not frustrating. It even makes me a little bit excited for the raid tier. And, I liked Ghoul Jaja. He's pretty much my favorite new character. He was really cool. He made me feel emotions, which is more than can be said for most characters. And he was pretty much the closest I got to crying throughout the entire expansion. So, he was great. 10 out of 10. And, well, that's about all the unconditional praise that I can give it. My opinions on the rest of the game are also pretty mixed, and in order to get into that, I'll need to go into the details of Dawntrail's story, so we can analyze if it works or if it doesn't work. So here's your spoiler warning. For all the faults of this expansion, I do think the story is worth experiencing on your own, so that you can form your own opinions before you listen to mine. So if you aren't finished with Dawntrail's main story quest, please go through and finish that first. Don't worry, I'll still be here by the time you're done. Probably. With that out of the way, let's go through numbered list style so we can decide together if Dawntrail's story was good, bad, or maybe just kind of mid. 1. The Scions. In my last video, one of my main points that most people seem to agree with was that the Scions should not be the main focus of the game anymore. We need to let a new cast of characters shine rather than focusing on the same group of characters that have already had so much development. And they kinda gave us that. The Scions' presence in Dawntrail is definitely much less, which is good. They seem to understand that those characters have all kind of run their course, and that to keep the game fresh, we need to give the spotlight to newer characters. No, not yet, lamat. We'll get to you, don't worry. But while the Scions aren't nearly as present story-wise or line-wise, they're still just kinda there. Kind of like awkwardly hanging around in the background of most scenes, to the point where I pointed out to a friend that Krile hadn't said a word in like 4 hours, and she insisted that Krile wasn't with us at all, only to come out of a cutscene and find Krile standing right off to the side. The twins and Krile in the first half of the game really did not need to be there. It kind of felt like they were just hanging around with us so that we'd have party members for the trust system. If you remove the twins and Krile from the first 3 areas and just have them show up when we, like, need someone to fight with us or something, the story is still exactly the same. And I actually think that Krile was done so dirty in this expansion that she's gonna get her own section later. As for Urianger and Thancred working with Kona, there was a lot of potential there for something interesting that also didn't really go anywhere. They make a few jokes about like, haha, we're competing, but they make no effort to actually be competitive outside of a single moment in the first dungeon where they block off an area with rocks and laugh at you and make you have to find a different path. I think we could have used a lot more moments like that to make it feel like an actual competition, because as it is, it definitely feels a little bit half-assed. And let's be honest, we end up working with Thancred and Urianger way more than we work against them. The competition is disregarded entirely by the second time we encounter them. At least the Stenian just kinda shows up, does whatever he wants, and then leaves. As for the other scions, they all just kind of walk on screen and go, "I'm here now," when it's their turn to show up, and then they also just hang around in the background. And like, yeah, it makes sense to call the characters who specialize in weird dimensional shit like Y'shtola and G'raha in the later half of the expansion, but did you have to point it out? Did you really have to walk this back and act like you're so clever for saying it? Did you really need to act like this is some kind of major reunion immediately into the next expansion? Did Hoary Boulder really mean so little to you? This entire scene just does not feel earned at all. And because the game refuses to accept time passing because it won't allow the twins to be older than 16 or 17, in-universe Dawntrail happens maybe a few months after the Scions disband. So it's kind of like you graduated high school and then at the end of the summer someone threw a 3-month high school reunion. Like, what's the point? Why bother? Not to mention that this little excited statement of yours comes right after everyone awkwardly looks away from Erenville because they all knew that his family is probably dead. But like, who cares? The Scions of the Seventh Dawn reunion! Yay! And like, yeah, I get it. This is kind of what Final Fantasy XIV does. They write off the cuff a lot of the time without any real long-term plans for the future, and they have to just work with whatever they've been given before. But the trick with that is that they don't usually point it out. You don't draw attention to it like, haha, it's the Scions of the Seventh Dawn all together again, and we're having a reunion. Isn't that so great, guys? Every scene with the Scion just feels like it's there to be fan service. The writing is nice with G'raha when he's on the boat with you, and I'm glad he's having such a good time, but why are we not having this scene with like Erenville or Kona or something? Why couldn't Kona come with us to the last area for that matter? Is it because G'raha fans will be mad if he doesn't get enough screen time? The whole thing feels just kind of bad to me, and if I look at this from the most cynical perspective possible, it feels like the Scions were written into the game to have the legal amount of lines required to be able to showcase them in the trailer and the marketing materials. I didn't even realize that Urianger and Thancred had come with us down to the gate until the camera suddenly panned over and oh, I guess they're here too. And some people are still gonna be like, well, these guys are our JRPG party, duh. But a JRPG party isn't usually full of a party of like 15 guys that just follow you around everywhere and don't say anything. Especially not at the start of a JRPG, like Dawntrail is apparently intended to be. Which brings me right to my next point. 2. Dawntrail is the start of a new arc. So they had kind of an interesting conundrum with Dawntrail. They had to make the beginning of an arc, but also it had to be a full expansion-wide story with appropriate stakes in order to keep people from calling it a 30-hour-long Beast Tribe quest, which they did anyway. So that just left us with an expansion that dramatically ramped everything up to ridiculous stakes again, starting at like level 97 when we're already 3/4 of the way through the story. And you really can't deny that the first half of the game is excruciatingly slow. You run around with lamat doing little Pokemon Sun and Moon style challenges to earn badges so that you can prove that lamat will be the best Hokage ever. And it's fine for what it is as a very low stakes adventure, giving your Warrior of Light a quote break from having to save the world all the time. And sure, fine, that's great. But once you finish with that and lamat gets her little coronation, the stakes suddenly ramp up dramatically. Like, suddenly there's a robot invasion, so you go to meet Sphene, who shows you around Magitech Land, and you learn that she wants to rejoin her reflection so that she can drain the soul of literally every living creature on the source to power the memory database of everyone who ever died in her kingdom. So that's dramatic. And I'm not gonna say I told you so because I was definitely wrong about a lot of stuff, but I totally called her entire motivation. Go watch my last video if you don't believe me. Anyway. It's kind of a huge tonal whiplash that feels very much like it was tacked on at the end so that we could have a huge world threat to combat because otherwise the stakes were too low. And I just don't know if they really nailed either side of this. The Pokemon Sun and Moon vacation is fun, but it's a little bit too chill, even with Bakul Jaja and his intervention and whole kidnapping thing. And then you have a robot attack and suddenly the entire world is at stake again. And in the end, I'm left wondering if they even set up anything for the next 10 years of expansions at all. Number 3, the next arc. What is the next arc after Dawntrail? If this is meant to set up the future of Final Fantasy XIV's story, what does it set up? based on the new MacGuffin we got at the very end, we can kind of assume that the next few expansions will also probably take us to other reflections, and maybe figure out some way to link them up or something. And it just kind of leaves me wondering if all the reflections are going to have some kind of random villain that wants to rejoin them and cause a calamity for reasons that are totally different than the Ascians. Because, let's face it, Sphene was basically an Ascian in all but name. She wants to rejoin a shard to the source, she needs to kill a lot of people to save the few that she has sentimental attachment to, she can teleport around between many bodies, she has a giant boss form that reflects her inner self, and she's the best designed character in the expansion. You get the picture. Is this what we're going to be up against now? Wannabe Ascians while the story itself seems afraid to mention them, even as Sphene is directly trying to cause another rejoining? And don't get me wrong here, I'm extremely relieved that they didn't make another Ascian main villain. They shouldn't be main characters anymore, if they're characters at all. But it does seem a little bit odd to dance around the subject of rejoinings and calamities and the sudden appearance of like a super powerful magical item without at least mentioning them. They dance around Electrope suddenly appearing out of nowhere, and it feels obvious to me that it was probably planted there by whatever Ascian was trying to rejoin that reflection to the source, right? And if it wasn't, then it's just kind of bad writing to have something that powerful and world-changing appear out of nowhere. Regardless, Dawntrail was actually such a contained story that it leaves me wondering if we'll even have Lamat, Erenville, or Kona join us in future expansions. And I kinda don't think that we will. They seem pretty set where they are, and they all went through their pretty big character arcs already. If you compare it to A Realm Reborn as an introduction arc, we're still dragging around characters with us from ARR. That's where we establish the Scions, and that's where we set up the Ascians and the Garleans as our main antagonists. So, what did Dawntrail do? Well, Sphene is dead, her reflection is empty now, and that all seems pretty handled, so I doubt any of them will show up as villains or otherwise. Zoraal is dead too, so he's out. I can't imagine Lamat or Kona joining us in future expansions, but maybe we can be generous and consider them like the different city leaders from ARR. Sure, that's fine. So, what does that leave us with, Erenville? As much as I respect them for committing to him just being a gleaner with no combat abilities, that means he's pretty unlikely to become a party member. So, what are we taking from Dawntrail into future expansions? Well, it seems like the only thing that might carry over will be the Magic Dimension Piss Cup, or whatever we got at the very end. I think this is the point that tips me into thinking that Dawntrail didn't really work, because even though it's supposed to be an introduction arc, it doesn't really give us anything that I think is going to carry into future expansions. The main antagonist dies, the second main antagonist dies, the last zone is entirely unusable, and it leaves next to nothing behind to build on. Which reminds me, let's take a look at the final zone and why I think it is probably the weakest part of the expansion. 4. Living Memory. The final zones of both Shadowbringers and Endwalker were obvious showstoppers, and the clear standout areas of their respective expansions. Both of those zones present something unique in terms of presentation and build-up, where the zone grows with you as you explore it and progress through the story. There's something uniquely magical about discovering the city of Amaurot for the first time, and the way the music builds during Ultima Thule as the Scions each sacrifice themselves one by one is such a clever piece of environmental storytelling. And well, it seemed like they tried to replicate that success with Living Memory. But we were never attached to Sphene or her reflection the way we were attached to Amaurot or the Ascians' view of the world they were trying to recreate. Emmett Selk was such a prominent and sympathetic character throughout Shadowbringers, and you really get to see his longing for the way his world used to be and the people that he desperately wants to see again. They made him very sympathetic, and it only hits harder when you see the city of Amaurot for the first time, and it's completely different from anything we've seen before. You can really understand the gravity of what he lost. But what about Living Memory? We were barely given any time to understand Sphene and her plight before she disappears, and while the world of Living Memory is interesting to look at and definitely has a wow factor to it when you first enter, we as the player just aren't very emotionally attached to it. It's just kind of a weird, random carnival of a zone. And it's only through our explorations through Living Memory that we get to see what Sphene was willing to sacrifice so much to protect. But the gimmick of this area is why I just think it doesn't work. You're essentially going around and shutting down the simulation server by server, which in turn ends the pseudo-existence of everyone there. It also fades the environments and makes them look bland and empty, while also turning off the music and leaving you in complete silence. It's kind of like they're holding up a sign that says "Cry Now" to a studio audience. And to me, I just really didn't feel it. I had no prior attachment to the worlds presented to me, and you're barely given any time with the environments before the game takes them away from you to try and make you feel the same loss that the characters are going through. But it isn't moving, and it isn't really even emotional. It's just kind of disappointing. Like, the game showed you this really pretty environment and nice looking final zone only to take it away from you moments later. It left me personally feeling really empty, and not in a satisfying way. I was just kind of like, well, alright. I don't get to run around in a cool looking zone anymore because the game wants to try and recapture the feeling of Ultima Thule and tell me to cry. If that's what they were trying to do, they completely missed the mark on that one too. Ultima Thule is successful in hitting the emotional beats that it wants to hit because with each loss and each sacrifice the scions make for you, it adds something to the environment. The music builds, paths are forged, and you can feel the impact that the scions had on the world around you. You can literally hear it as more vocals and instruments are added to the background music. When they cut the music in living memory, it just doesn't feel very poignant or make me understand the weight of what I did or make me feel bad or whatever. It's just kind of annoying because now I'm running around doing my silly little Aether Current quests in total silence in an area that now also isn't very visually interesting to look at either. It doesn't make me want to return or fly around to enjoy the ambiance of the zone while I'm in it. It makes me want to finish up these stupid quests and get out of here as soon as possible. The game wants you to simultaneously feel the loss the characters are going through and understand the themes of letting something that you love go, while at the same time it refuses to let go of the scions. It ends up feeling toothless. And in the end, all you really do is ruin an interesting looking area before you can grow attached to it, and you're left with nothing. And it's indicative of the same issue that I mentioned earlier, where it feels like nothing in Dawntrail will be relevant going forward for future expansions to build on. For me, I think this is the main fault of Dawntrail, and probably the reason why most people feel like it's a filler arc. It's pretty much a self-contained story that doesn't have a whole lot of impact on the world or the story going forward. Even the ending zone is a contained story that leaves nothing behind, where you unplug all the servers and leave it as an empty husk. But filler arcs aren't actually the worst thing ever, and it's not bad to have a break or a self-contained story, especially after such a cataclysmic event like the entire arc up until Endwalker. Filler arcs can be really good for character development, and putting the spotlight on characters that don't usually get any of it is usually the point of filler arcs. So let's take a look at the characters next to see if Dawntrail at least succeeded in writing good, engaging character arcs. 5. Krile. I'm not a Krile fan, but even I can see that she was done dirty. All you have to do is point to the scene right after the Skydeep Senno, which is where the shot of Krile that they really focused on in one of the gameplay trailers comes from. The one where she's looking around the gold area in awe, and it's kind of disingenuous because that scene is like mostly lamat talking, and Krile is just kind of unsure about everything. And finding the City of Gold was the whole reason she came with us in the first place. She does eventually get a little bit of attention with her parents in probably the worst area and the worst part of the entire final zone, but that's it. For a character showcased so heavily in the trailers, Krile really doesn't get a whole lot to do, and she doesn't even have much of a narrative focus on her character arc. And her entire character and reason for going to find the City of Gold in the first place was because of her connection to her grandfather. She wants to learn more about him and see a part of him again, and that's disregarded the moment she learned she was a baby delivered from a weird portal. From that moment on, instead of her character being about her grandfather, the man who actually raised her and took care of her, to being about her parents that she never knew and getting closure with them instead. She doesn't even get to open the gate by herself with her stupid little USB drive earring. She has to give it to a baby to do it. Like her one big moment in the expansion, and she has to share it. There isn't even a whole lot more that I can say about Krile because she just doesn't have any presence in the story. And it's kind of sad for her. She was the only member of the Scions that really needed some kind of development arc, and I can't say she really gets it. 6. Zoraal. And speaking of having barely any presence in the story, in Zoraal's case, however, I think it's actually intentional. I think Zoraal is meant to serve as lamat's narrative shadow, in a sense. Everything about him is incredibly subtle, where everything about lamat is very loud and in your face. And while I see the point of what they were going for, I think his character overall kind of suffers for this. I think Zoraal could have been a really great villain, and I think there is a really great villain somewhere inside the writers' heads, but we just don't get to see any of it. Zoraal is almost entirely characterized through dialogue of other characters talking about him, and anything we get from him personally is very, very subtle. There's a lot there if you're willing to look for it, but it doesn't feel like any of it actually clicks until his boss fight, and then all the subtlety basically goes out the window. And I think the subtle characterization that they go for with him would have worked really well if Dawntrail wasn't such an in-your-face, tell-don't-show expansion, because it kind of drowns him out and makes him feel like he isn't a character at all until he goes full evil mode. Bakul Jaja, on the other hand, goes through a very interesting character arc and emerges from it as an engaging character that I don't really have any complaints about. I think he's great. No, not that great, not that great. But it feels like they focus a lot on Bakul Jaja in the earlier parts of the expansion, and they should have given Zoraal a little bit more time to develop his relationships, especially with Lamat. The biggest example of how I think they failed Zoraal as a character was in the cooking trial. Why is Lamat paired with Kona here? It's not like the characters themselves get to choose, it's a random lottery, and it was the perfect opportunity to pair Lamat with Zoraal so that we could see a contrast of their ideals and personalities. We would have even gotten to see how he interacts with her as his sister. And they just chose not to do this. They picked the safe option, they paired us with Kona and Thancred and Urianger, and we get no character development or struggle out of this trial. We just get a fetch quest. I feel bad for Zoraal. His boss fight was honestly pretty good, and it made me realize that he's a very tragic character, and that his story is really sad to me. But only in retrospect. I feel like he kinda gets the short end of the narrative stick, and that's a shame. And it's even more of a shame that we'll never get cute Gap Moe of Zoraal making tacos. Honestly, criminal of them not to give that to us. 7. Sphene. Another character that kind of gets the short end of the narrative stick is Sphene. I think in order for her to be effective, she needed to be introduced way earlier in the story. She shows up pretty late, and we really don't get enough time with her to grow attached to her as a character before she has her heel face turn. And then after that, we don't get enough time with her as an antagonist, since she shows up very early in the final zone and then just doesn't appear at all until the end. If you compare it to a character like Medion, where you're given a whole zone to grow attached to her, and then after her heel face turn, she appears periodically to taunt the main characters in the final zone, Sphene is much less effective. And out of every character in Dawntrail, I think Sphene is the one that I can probably relate the most to regarding these themes and motivations and why she cuts off her emotions the way that she does. The themes they were trying to set up with her and Lamat, and even Zoraal regarding what people expect from you and how not to judge your worth based off of others, is very compelling. But I think it's all just kind of told to us rather than shown, and she's in and out of the story in the span of a zone and a half. I think Sphene could have worked as a good foil for Lamat, especially regarding the themes of self-value and living up to expectations. I see what they were going for there, but Lamat herself even has barely any time to get to know Sphene. But even though Sphene ends up addressing you in most of her earlier scenes, it's Lamat that gets that moment with her at the end. You're just kind of standing there. Which I think highlights one of the major issues that people have with Dawntrail. Number 8. Lamat. Alright, fine. It's time to talk about Lamat. So here's where I'm gonna stray a little bit, because I actually think that Lamat has a decent story arc. She was given the most narrative attention by far, and by virtue of that, I think she experienced more growth as a character than every other character in Dawntrail combined. Which makes sense. This was, without a doubt, Lamat's story. But I think a lot of the reason why Final Fantasy XIV initially connected with so many different people is because it's a story about you. You can decide how the main character acts. The game lets you fill in the blanks in your head with what your character might be feeling in the moment, and it's really easy to immerse yourself in your character and your story. Most of the characters talk to you specifically, and they make their stories personally intertwined with yours. And they all talk directly to you and make you, the player, feel really special. And Dawntrail wasn't that. It wasn't about you. It was about Lamat. And while I will admit that Lamat did grow on me, and that I did enjoy watching her journey as a character that I found annoying and grating, grow into someone that was a more mature leader, and while I definitely wouldn't say it was perfect by any means, I do think she gets some cool moments where she gets to grow as a character. The scene where she decides to work together with Kona to keep up the vow of reason/resolve duality is very sweet, and a good moment of growth for both of them. I even like the scene of her confronting Zoraal. I think it showcases her character really well. But she's still not the kind of character that I like. Lamat is just so in your face all the time that I got kind of tired of her. I shouldn't be feeling so fatigued by a character that I'm relieved when we're sent off alone with Erenville for a few quests. And in the final scene, it is hard to deny that your character is just in the same position the scions were with you in the initial zones. You're just kind of standing there awkwardly in the background, while Sphene and Lamat get to have their heart-to-heart. And to people who didn't like Lamat at all, I can see why this was annoying. It doesn't feel earned, especially because of the way the game is played. She wasn't fighting the Eternal Queen. She wasn't desperately trying to keep her party alive or dying to holes in the wall or frantically hitting the healer limit break 3 because otherwise we're all gonna wipe. That was you. Or me. So, having Lamat jump in at the very end to save the day kind of feels like she's stealing all your glory. And I do understand that this is her story, not ours. But while I was cheering her on in the scenes where she actually confronted Zoraal, I found it hard not to be annoyed with her here. It's like they were trying to repeat the end of the Endsinger fight where the scions give you their energy, and that's how you can defeat her with the power of friendship. But it's also trying to repeat the Rain and Gaia story and make this just about Sphene and Lamat. And the difference between them and the Rain and Gaia story is that Rain and Gaia had actual development with each other. They're obviously friends, and the Eden storyline is about their growing relationship. Dawntrail is not about Lamat and Sphene's relationship. They barely even know each other. A lot of the issue with Dawntrail's writing is that it feels at times like the narrative just doesn't have space for anyone but Lamat. And it feels like she pushes the other characters out of the way to tell her own story, including you. So, no, I don't think anyone is joyless or lacks love if they didn't like Lamat. Her type of character definitely isn't my favorite, and so I know I enjoyed the expansion less, which is okay. Everyone likes different things, and what appeals to me probably won't appeal to you. And I can pretty definitively say that since Lamat was basically the main character of the expansion, that if you didn't like her, you probably hated Dawntrail. But if you liked Lamat, I bet you really enjoyed it. That's what I think a lot of the online discourse about this expansion kind of boils down to. And while Dawntrail had a lot of stuff that didn't land all that well, I don't actually think that the blame lies entirely on Lamat. Maybe the blame lies in references? Number 9, references. Okay, for legal reasons that was a joke, kinda. But the later half of Dawntrail was basically just Final Fantasy IX references all the way down, so I feel like I need to address it. First, this is only the way that I judge references in main story quests. I know that the side content is almost always made up of references, but side content is optional, and it's not part of the main storyline of the game. And also, they usually make it pretty known what they're referencing, so it feels intentional instead of being blindsided by it. So here's my thing with references, alright? If someone who isn't a fan of the game being referenced can still enjoy the content without realizing that it's a reference, I think it's okay. Let's compare Sphene versus Golbez in this case. Sphene is an interesting character with a fun new design and a little bit of character development. You can look at her and not know immediately that she's a reference to something, unless you're a fan of Final Fantasy IX and realize that she's referencing Garnet. Then it's like a fun little Easter egg you get as a Final Fantasy IX fan, and I can enjoy Sphene's pretty design and her cute character. Now let's look at Golbez. He does not have a design or a name that differentiates him from Final Fantasy IV Golbez. Him and his little clown cartoon fiends are basically direct rips from Final Fantasy IV that seem kind of jarring in the more serious context of Final Fantasy XIV. Like, he's just kind of a giant metal armor man even before he got hit by the evil beam that turned him evil. And it's never explained why he looks like that. He's just Golbez from Final Fantasy IV. So, Sphene is her own character, different from Garnet. Golbez is just straight up copy-pasted into 14. Okay, but Dawntrail had a lot more than just Sphene. Alexandria is so obviously a reference that it also kind of took me out of the game a little bit, especially considering how different Solution 9 is. And while I get that that was some kind of hyper-tech land that was developed after hundreds of years in the Time Cube, I personally think that just ripping Alexandria from Final Fantasy IX takes away from giving it its own identity as a reflection of the source. They could have designed a tech city that felt a little bit more like Solution 9, and not just like a generic fantasy city. because that's what it looked like to me, someone who has no emotional attachment to Final Fantasy IX. And because it's also been pointed out to me several times, Solution 9 is another example of an acceptable reference. It's just taking the name of one of Zidane's attacks, and doesn't actually seem to be anything copy-pasted over from another Final Fantasy game. And I also think Alexandria was still a pretty fun dungeon, because the mechanics were great and engaging, and the glitch effect was pretty fun. But it definitely lacked an identity of its own, and that made it feel kind of unmemorable in the end. Or at worst, just a cheap copy of Amarat trying to get you to feel the same thing about a city with significantly less development to it. And if you do compare it to Amarat, or even the Final Days, nothing about the environments in Alexandria really stand out all that much, other than the glitchy computer effects and the boss rooms. It feels like wasted potential when they could have done a lot more interesting stuff with their MacGuffin and Electrope and the architecture of Solution 9 to make a city unlike anything we've ever seen before in 14 or in any other Final Fantasy game. Which is why I wish they wouldn't rely so heavily on just taking designs from other games. They went so hard with the tech theme only to pull back so that they could make Final Fantasy IX fans gasp and clap their hands because they recognize something. And relying on references is just kind of lazy writing, isn't it? Like, you don't have to work as hard to write a compelling story if you just use something that people already like, because you're guaranteed to get people to like it just by virtue of including something that they recognize. Like, I'm sure it was very emotional for fans of Final Fantasy IX to see Alexandria get destroyed. They're already kind of attached to it, so you don't have to write anything. You can just rely on the callback to do everything for you. That seems like the definition of cutting corners to me. I even saw someone say this in Say Chat while I was working through the quest in Heritage Found, so maybe it's even getting too gratuitous for some fans of Final Fantasy. But in the end, this is all just my opinion. If you have your own, you're welcome to leave it in the comments below. I love a good debate more than anything, so I'm genuinely pretty curious to see what you guys thought. I enjoy this game a lot, even as someone who isn't a fan of Final Fantasy as a franchise, and I'm a pretty big believer in looking at media critically. I say all of this out of a genuine love for the game and a desire to see it continue to improve. Overall, the conclusion that I reached is that Dawntrail just didn't work as a story for me, and a lot of the things that I was initially concerned about turned out to be true. The themes didn't connect with me as much as the ones in Shadowbringers and Endwalker did. The pacing was really slow and then suddenly way too fast, and I just wasn't as into the characters that it focused on. There were a lot of jarring issues with the story too that I just could not overlook. Was this the worst thing that I've ever played? No, obviously not. I enjoyed my time playing with friends, and I thought the fights and the gameplay were the best they've ever been, but I'm not afraid to say that the story was pretty mid, and that I hope future expansions go in a different direction. And hey, they managed to recover from the mess that was Stormblood, so I still have faith in the writers for future expansions. It'll take a little bit more than that to turn me into a story-skipping writer. If you made it this far, why not consider subscribing? Or liking the video, since both things really help me out a lot. And I super appreciate it. Putting out opinions on the internet can be kind of intimidating. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time! Bye! Oh no, I turned my model dark. Fuck. Oh my god, I'm ruining everything. No, I don't even know. I don't remember how to change back. Oh, there we go.